Hey guys, tonight we're going way, way back to ancient Babylon, where clay tablets told stories, ziggurats scraped the skies, and spirits got stuck in storage rooms. Yes, seriously. You're about to trudge through moonlit corridors of dust-covered amphorae, whispering winds, and the occasional tormented soul who couldn't quite find the exit. This isn't your average bedtime tale. It's a slow crawl through superstition, clutter, and the eerily human fear of being forgotten behind a pile of barley sacks. And no, you probably won't survive this if you're the kind of person who forgets what's in your own attic. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The scent hits first, a dusty mix of dried figs, old parchment, and something just a bit off. You're in an ancient Babylonian granary, half buried in the sand of the centuries. The torchlight flickers along crumbling mud brick walls. You brush past a stack of clay jars, each one tagged with cuneiform, once meant to track grain shipments. But here's the odd part. Something else lingers. A presence, cold where the air should be warm. Your hair stands up, and you get the distinct feeling you're not alone. To the Babylonians, this wasn't just imagination. They believed strongly in spirits, particularly the Giddim, the souls of the dead. Some were honored ancestors. Others, though, were lost, trapped, unsettled. And strangely often, these lost souls seemed to gather in storage rooms. You might think, why not a graveyard, a haunted battlefield, a blood-soaked temple floor? Nope. Try a dark pantry filled with dusty onions and defunct scrolls. The Babylonians didn't mess around with the afterlife. You had to be buried properly, given the right rites, and remembered. If not, well, your Giddim could wander, confused and angry. And apparently spiritual GPS didn't exist back then, because many of these confused souls wound up stuck in storage rooms. Historians still argue whether this belief stemmed from literal ghost sightings or metaphorical anxieties about neglect and disorder. But let's take a step back. You're walking through Babylon, 1700 BCE. Maybe you're a temple scribe, sandals dusted with clay, distracted by your to-do list. Deliver fish to the priest, make an offering to Marduk, and, oh yeah, don't accidentally anger any spirits. You pass the great ziggurat, the Etemenanki, and head toward the merchant district, where every home has a storage area packed with life's essentials. Dates, oil, bronze tools, and, according to popular fear, the occasional dead relative's Giddim hanging around because someone forgot to say a prayer last equinox. In many Babylonian homes, storage rooms were dark and rarely entered. Things were just shoved in and forgotten. Sound familiar? That eerie familiarity made them perfect liminal spaces between use and disuse, life and death, the seen and be ignored. No wonder people thought spirits liked them. It's like the spiritual equivalent of your junk drawer. The ancient tablets don't always explain this directly, of course. Babylonian scribes weren't exactly writing BuzzFeed listicles titled "Top 10 Signs Your Storage Room is Haunted AF." But we do get indirect clues. Ritual texts warning against entering storage rooms without offerings, prayers asking for protection in narrow spaces, and even legal tablets listing curses placed on stolen storage items, lest the thief bring home more than grain. Quirky side note, there's a fringe theory that Babylonian guards sometimes refused to enter temple storerooms at night, not just for robbers or snakes, but because they genuinely feared running into a Giddim. Imagine calling in sick because your shift involves maybe being spiritually possessed. Honestly, relatable. Some scholars believe these storage-haunting spirits weren't evil per se, just disoriented. Think of them as cosmic wrong place, wrong time types. Others suspect that these beliefs masked deeper fears about social decay. When things are forgotten, neglected, they become strange, even dangerous. Spirits weren't just ghosts, they were symbols of disorder, of memory gaps, of spiritual housekeeping gone awry. Still, debates rage in academic circles. Was it literal belief? Metaphor? A tool to enforce social rituals like regular offerings and home cleanliness? Historians still argue whether the Babylonian fear of storage spirits was rooted in genuine supernatural experience or broader psychological unease. But you shuffle along a narrow corridor, its walls pressing in like they're trying to share a secret. The air smells faintly of ash and old oil. At the far end, a heavy wooden door leans crooked on its hinges, half-rotted, like even it's tired of keeping things in. You nudge it open, and inside, shelves sagging under baskets of dried herbs, rows of clay jars sealed with wax, and, center stage, a single object that looks utterly out of place. A small clay figurine upside down in a bowl. This isn't a toy or an accident. This is an apotropaic charm, a kind of Babylonian DIY spiritual pest control, and it speaks volumes about how seriously they took storage room spirits. See, it wasn't enough to know the names of ghosts or to give your aunt a halfway decent burial. You had to protect your space constantly, especially your storage rooms. After all, those little dusty chambers were where wealth was hidden. And in ancient Babylon, wealth wasn't shiny gold coins, it was food, oil, tools, practical, delicious, easily cursed things. Apotropaic magic, that's your fancy phrase for protective ritual objects, was the Babylonians' spiritual duct tape. Figurines, talismans, wall symbols, chants. If it could confuse, deter, or trap a restless spirit, it found a home on your shelves. Figurines like the one you're staring at were often buried beneath thresholds, stuck in wall niches, or, when things got real desperate, burned. What's especially telling is how specific they got. A common charm featured a squatting man holding what looks like a stick. His face is pinched in a grimace, like he's either really angry or trying to remember where he put his keys. Scholars say this guy was Pazuzu. Yes, that Pazuzu, the demon famously misused in The Exorcist. But in Babylon, Pazuzu was protective. Ugly, fierce, and supernaturally effective at keeping worse things away. Like using one monster to scare off another. Horror movie logic 100% endorsed by ancient Mesopotamians. Mainstream historians agree that these objects weren't just for show. They were placed strategically, near doors, on shelves, inside food storage. Think of them as ancient security systems. Instead of motion detectors and blinking blue lights, you got lumpy demon figurines silently screaming at ghosts. Of course, the exact meanings are up for debate. Some scholars argue that the figurines weren't protective at all, but rather sympathetic magic. The idea being that by giving a spirit a body, even a tiny clay one, you could trap it. House spirit giving you grief? Make it a body, stick it in a bowl, put a lid on it, done. One-step haunting solution. Then there's the fringe camp, the ones who say these figurines didn't trap spirits, they negotiated with them. Like tiny offerings, meant to say, here's your space, now leave mine alone. The equivalent of a ghost Airbnb, respectful, polite, and just a little creepy. But Babylonian protections didn't stop at figurines. They had spells. Oh boy, did they have spells. You'd recite chants while walking the perimeter of your storeroom, sometimes holding a palm frond, sometimes just muttering under your breath like a very sleep-deprived wizard. And these weren't quick phrases like "be gone, foul spirit." These were full-on poetic incantations invoking gods, ancestors, celestial bodies, and occasionally livestock. You sit down on a worn stone bench along the far wall, noting the strange scratch marks just above eye level. Spiral-shaped, uneven, rhythmic. Possibly protective sigils, possibly just some bored scribe testing his stylus. Either way, they feel deliberate. In Babylonian culture, repetition was power. A line repeated 3 times wasn't just dramatic, it was magical. So maybe these spirals are a silent chant, one that never stops spinning. Historians still argue whether these symbols had fixed meanings or were more improvisational, like spiritual graffiti. Some storerooms had dozens, others none. Was it about status, geography, or just whether your local priest had a flair for interior hex design? Now for your quirky detail of the night. One recovered storage room in Nippur had a full wall of painted fish bones arranged in the shape of a god's name. That's right, fish bones. Why? Theories range from symbol of fertility to ward against rot to, my personal favorite, because someone ran out of clay. Not every spell has to be Pinterest perfect. Your sandals crunch softly on the grit-dusted floor as you move deeper into the stillness, the kind of silence that hums in your ears like it's trying to say something. You pass through a narrow threshold, ducking under a lintel that feels far too low for comfort, and there, painted faintly in ochre on the cracked mud brick wall, is a curious symbol. 2 hands raised with palms out, and beneath them, a figure in profile, hollow-eyed, mouth agape. This, you soon realize, is one of the oldest known depictions of a giddim, a wandering spirit. To the Babylonians, the giddim wasn't some shrieking banshee or cloaked ghoul. No, the giddim was something quieter, more tragic, a soul without a place, a whisper looking for an echo. And it was terrifying precisely because of how ordinary it was. The giddim looked just like the person they had been, only now forgotten, unseen, reduced to flickers in the corner of your eye or a strange taste in your bread. You see, when someone died in Babylon, they needed more than just a hole in the ground. They needed rituals, real ones. You had to name them, feed them symbolically, and acknowledge their transition into the realm of the dead. If you didn't, well, they became what we'd call the living dead, except way less zombie apocalypse and way more bureaucracy gone wrong. The giddim lingered, they watched, they got cranky, and worst of all, they weren't rare. One tablet from roughly 3,800 years old, lists multiple types of giddim, each with their own brand of spooky drama. There's the spirit of the unburied, the spirit of the wrongly buried, the spirit of the forgotten, and even, curiously, the spirit of one buried with poor quality beer, which, frankly, might be the most Babylonian haunting imaginable. But spirits didn't float around willy-nilly like CGI ghosts in a movie. The giddim was bound to the realm it had once known. It moved through narrow alleys, clung to the edge of lamplight, and yes, often curled up in those quiet, neglected places where no one looked twice. Places like the back of a storage room, where the walls sweat salt, and the only company is a toppled basket of dried beans. Historians still argue whether the giddim was meant to reflect real experiences, hallucinations during mourning, for instance, or if it served more as a spiritual scapegoat. Strange illness in the house? Must be a giddim. Sudden rot in the barley? Definitely a giddim. That eerie feeling you get when your hand brushes something cold and damp in the dark? Giddim vibes. Fringe theory alert, some scholars even speculate that giddim stories served a practical purpose, to make people take funerary obligations seriously. After all, nothing motivates a family to spring for a decent burial quite like the threat of Great Aunt Ninsen spending eternity moaning behind the olive jars. And the language used to describe these spirits always tinged with loneliness. They wander, they seek, they call out with no answer. It's not all jump scares and blood curses. It's mostly sadness wrapped in superstition. The ancient equivalent of someone texting hello and never getting a reply. You crouch beside a clay jar now, noticing a fine black line painted near the lip, a protective mark maybe. The Babylonians believed that certain symbols could deter spirits, like posting a polite "no trespassing" sign for the dead. It's a charmingly hopeful idea that a glyph scratched into clay could tell a spirit, "Sorry, this room's full." And yet, they still came. You hear it in their rituals, read it between the lines of their myths. No matter how many boundaries they drew between the living and the dead, someone always forgot an offering, skipped a name, or died inconveniently during a sandstorm. And that's how you gotta get him. One particularly unnerving detail: the get him didn't just spook you. It could sap your strength, leech your luck, or cause household animals to act weird. The Babylonians believed these spirits could mess with your dreams, appearing as shadows, making you speak their name in sleep, or worse, waking you up with that sense of someone else being in the room. Totally fine, nothing to worry about. Sleep tight. You reach the far wall of the chamber now, where an old offering bowl still sits, dried residue lining the rim. Maybe beer, maybe honey, maybe just dust and memory now. The bowl is shallow, ceremonial. Someone left it here a long time ago for a spirit they didn't want to follow them home. Smart move. Interestingly, some texts describe spirits being appeased by these offerings, meaning that even the get-em could be reasoned with. You didn't have to battle them, just acknowledge them. Kind of like telling your phone ghost, "Yes, I see you're turning the volume down randomly. Noted. Please stop." The door scrapes close behind you, muffling the sound of the wind whispering through the stone streets of the ancient city. You're standing in another storeroom now, this one cooler, quieter, more cramped. A cracked amphora leans against the wall like it's too tired to stand properly. Above it, etched into the plaster, is a tiny figure barely the size of your palm, hunched, wide-eyed, mouth stitched shut. This one isn't a get-em. It's something worse. This is an utaku. Unlike the lonely, misunderstood get-em, the utaku was no accidental lingerer. These spirits were malevolent by design, or at least that's how they were feared. Think of them as Babylonian poltergeists with a grudge and just enough free time to mess with your entire life. They were often blamed for serious misfortune: sickness, madness, crops dying overnight, your ox kicking the only clay tablet with your tax records on it. The utaku could slip through spaces, cracks in a wall, an open window, a gap beneath the door. And guess where they like to hide? That's right, in the dark, forgotten corners of homes, especially in storage rooms. Nothing says inviting haunted real estate like a musty room with no windows and 14-year-old lentils. What's fascinating is that the utaku wasn't always evil. There's actually a split in Babylonian lore: good utaku versus evil utaku. Like angel-devil twins who both showed up to your housewarming party, but only one brought snacks. The good ones were said to protect people, especially temples and city gates. The evil ones? They were the ones who overstayed their welcome in your pantry and whispered things to you while you tried to nap. Mainstream historians still debate whether the utaku was ever seen as a distinct spirit type, or just a variant of other demons or souls. The texts get fuzzy, much like the line between mischievous ghost and supernatural squatter with commitment issues. The distinction blurs further when you look at the rituals meant to banish them, often identical to those used for generic bad spirits, which, in Babylonian terms, is basically everything that isn't a sheep. One clay tablet from the library of Ashurbanipal, for example, describes how to clear a dwelling of sickness and haunting, using a mix of chants, burning juniper, and sprinkling water with a small broom. Yes, a broom. Ancient Babylonian exorcisms were part magic, part spring cleaning. And here's your quirky fringe detail of the day. Some rituals suggested smearing the blood of a sacrificed pig on the thresholds and corners of a storeroom to trap the utaku inside. Practical? Maybe not. Effective? Who's to say? Messy? Oh, absolutely. Imagine explaining that to your neighbors. Don't worry, it's not cursed. It's just pork-based protection. You crouch near a stone shelf, tracing the outline of a tiny clay tablet. This one's a protective amulet, half buried in dust. The inscription's nearly gone, but you can just make out the symbol for Nergal, god of the underworld and general bad vibes. If you wanted to keep an utaku out of your grain sacks, you called on Nergal, or sometimes on Shamash, god of the sun, because what better way to fight dark spirits than overwhelming burning light? But not everyone could afford divine protection. Most people made do with household idols, little clay figures you might tuck in the corner of your storeroom or hang over the door. Sometimes these idols wore comically oversized beards or angry eyes, meant to frighten anything spooky enough to understand facial expressions. Still, nothing was foolproof. In some households, if food spoiled too quickly or the beer went sour, people wouldn't blame bacteria or bad storage. They'd assumed an utaku had gotten in, maybe through a cracked jar, maybe through the bad dream you had last week. Spirits were tricky that way. What really set the utaku apart was their interaction with dreams. It wasn't just about haunting your house, they could haunt your sleep. People would wake with scratch marks, bruises, or strange pains and immediately blame an unseen hand. One Babylonian medical tablet even linked sleep paralysis, what we'd now chalk up to REM misfires, with the grip of a lurking utaku. So, next time you can't move and you swear something's sitting on your chest, just think, ancient Babylon beat us to the diagnosis by about 3 millennia. And again, we come back to those ever-mysterious storage rooms. Why here? Why not the flashy temple halls or the bustling open-air markets? Because storerooms were private, quiet, and often sealed. They were places where offerings were made in secret, where items of value, grain, oil, scrolls, were hidden away. Places people forgot, places that didn't always get purified. A spirit in a temple got noticed. A spirit in a pantry could linger for years, bumping jars and curdling oil like it was on a low-effort haunting contract. You run your hand along the inside wall now, feeling a faint chill where the bricks meet. Some believe the walls themselves. You duck under a warped wooden beam, its age curling the fibers like driftwood. Your torch gutters slightly, casting strange shadows across the stone floor. Welcome to the Babylonian universe. Not just the physical city of mud brick and bustling bazaars, but the entire cosmology stitched into every prayer, omen, and suspicious knocking noise in a dark corridor. The Babylonians didn't view the world like we do. Flat maps, hemispheres, countries outlined in neon GPS routes. No, for them, existence was a layered, breathing thing. You're walking through the middle layer now. Earth, or Ki. Above you, An, the sky realm, where gods like Anu and Ishtar loitered around, doing god things. Below your sandals lies Kur, the netherworld, the quiet, dusty place where souls went to chew clay and feel generally underwhelmed forever. And somewhere between all this, spirits got stuck. Not every spirit made it straight to the netherworld buffet. If you didn't get a proper burial, or your name wasn't spoken anymore, or, let's say, you had unfinished business involving a misplaced ledger of lentil debts, you might end up wandering. Not necessarily dangerous, just confused, and maybe lingering. It's no accident that the Babylonian spirit world mirrored their actual society, highly structured, deeply hierarchical. The gods had ranks, the cities had ranks, and yes, even the dead had social status. Honored ancestors got offerings, wine, bread, incense. The unlucky or unimportant, they became the walking dead, the etamu. These weren't rotting zombies, more like overextended house guests that nobody invited. Quirky detail? Babylonians believed that if someone died in a foreign land and wasn't buried properly, their spirit might never find the way to the underworld. So not only did you have to worry about dying, you had to worry about dying wrong. That's like failing an exam after graduation. Worse, the unlucky spirit might wander until it found a place, any place, to rest. A forgotten pantry, a sealed grain bin, maybe under your cousin's bedroll. This is where the cosmology gets oddly bureaucratic. The underworld wasn't all chaos and wailing. It had gates, judges, a queen named Irish-Kegel who ruled with dusty indifference. The entrance to this realm wasn't even that hard to find, if you were dead, that is. The trouble came if you lacked the right credentials, name offerings, rituals, ancestral remembrance. Without these, you got stuck. Some historians liken this to modern spiritual limbo, neither here nor there. Others argue the Babylonian cur wasn't necessarily about punishment, but exclusion. You're denied entry not because you're bad, but because you're forgotten. And what's worse than being remembered as evil? Not being remembered at all. Imagine the soul as a traveler with no passport, pacing border control for eternity. And now imagine that traveler finds an old storeroom with some warmth, a crack of light, a jar of dried figs that smells vaguely like home, and decides, well, this will do. That, according to fringe theory, might explain why storage rooms became spiritual hotspots. But the real fascination is how the physical mirrored the spiritual. Babylon was built with levels, temples above, people in the middle, canals flowing underfoot like veins. The cosmos, too, was tiered: heaven, earth, netherworld. Even storage rooms followed this logic, often sunk slightly into the ground, beneath the main living space. You descend into them. Symbolically, you're approaching the underworld, with sacks of barley instead of lost souls, hopefully. It's late now. Babylon is sleeping. The city cools under the stars. You can hear distant reed flutes and the slow plod of watchmen's feet on the outer wall. But here, in this dim back room, everything feels still, timeless. You run your fingers across a wall etching, a crude drawing of a figure with wide eyes, arms raised. Possibly a god, or a warning. It's hard to tell. Clay doesn't come with labels. One of the more debated topics among historians is how literally the Babylonians took this cosmology. Did they truly believe the dead might peek out from under storage jars? Or were these metaphors that bled into folk traditions over time? Historians still argue whether the elaborate structure of the afterlife was practical theology or just a really organized ghost story. But for the average Babylonian, cosmology wasn't abstract. It lived in rituals, in calendar dates, in offerings placed carefully next to the stored barley. You didn't need to understand why it.
You shuffle out of the priest's archive, eyes blinking as the dust swirls in the light. Behind you, the clay tablets sit motionless, but the words they hold feel anything but dead. You know now, these were not passive beliefs. The Babylonians worked overtime to keep their spiritual paperwork in order. But the thing is, ghosts weren't just feared because they were dead. They were feared because they were embarrassing. Seriously. You're about to uncover the awkward truth about haunted storage rooms. They exposed your failures. You turn a corner and descend into a slightly lower chamber where baskets once sat stacked in neat rows. This place is colder, quieter. There's no ritual soot on the walls, no signs of recent use. It's a room abandoned mid-function, like someone left during an argument and never came back. To Babylonians, haunting wasn't just a spooky occurrence. It was often a sign you had neglected someone or something, and that someone had noticed. That's right, ghosts were receipts. Let's say your great-uncle died last spring. You forgot his annual offering. Maybe you skipped his burial beer. Maybe you didn't bury him at all because you were dealing with that whole barley theft scandal. Either way, surprise, he's in your storeroom now, banging around in a jar, rattling the lid, flickering your torchlight. Mainstream historians agree that failing your dead relatives was a major spiritual crime. The Babylonians believed the dead had needs: ritual food, words of praise, formal memory. Miss the mark, and the deceased could come knocking. Not to hurt you necessarily, just to remind you, hey, remember me? In your lentils. But here's the juicy fringe theory. Some scholars argue that these storeroom spirits weren't just ignored ancestors. They might have been deliberately omitted ones, like ex-lovers, outcast family members, even disgraced priests. People you chose not to remember. In Babylonian thinking, that could backfire. Forget someone too well, and they'll come back louder. One especially awkward cuneiform tablet tells of a man named Nabu Bel-Shunu, who reported that his storeroom was filled with a terrible smell and strange whispers. Turns out he had refused to bury his cousin because of a property dispute. Guess where the cousin ended up? Smack dab in the wheat bin. Historians still argue whether these stories were real experiences or more like cautionary parables. You know, like the ancient equivalent of, if you leave the fridge open, the food ghosts will get in. But for the Babylonians, the embarrassment was real. You imagine it. Neighbors whispering, "Did you hear about Ishtar's boy? Haunted again. Must have skipped grandma's bowl of beans last year." Your haunted storeroom became social proof that you were spiritually sloppy. And there was another layer, because in Babylon, haunting didn't stop at personal shame. It reflected on your whole house. If your storeroom went weird, it could mean your house gods were angry, that the order of your domestic world had unraveled. That's why many Babylonian homes had small altars near or even inside their storage spaces. These weren't just decorative, they were divine check-in points. You'd light incense, pour a drop of oil, maybe say a few protective words before scooping your grain. It wasn't just good manners, it was self-defense. In some cases, families installed protective figurines, tiny clay guardians shaped like lions, dogs, or mythical creatures with huge bug-eyed faces. One popular one? Pazuzu. Yes, the very demon who'd eventually inspire the movie The Exorcist. Back then, though, he was more of a spirit repellent, ugly enough to scare off anything weirder than him. Archaeologists have found these figurines buried under thresholds, hidden behind shelves, even tucked into grain sacks. Think of them as the ancient version of putting googly eyes on your pantry to keep spirits in check. Effective? Debatable. Adorable? Unquestionably. And don't think these ghostly mix-ups were rare. Records show that city priests often made rounds after festivals to purify households, especially storerooms. That's right, post-party spiritual cleanup. You might have been celebrating New Year. Your storage spirit was plotting revenge over that unsalted lentil cake. There's even an old Babylonian saying, scrawled messily into a scratched tablet, that translates loosely to, "What is forgotten feeds the dead." It wasn't just superstition, it was worldview. Here's the kicker. Scholars still don't agree on how much of this was religious and how much was social control. Was the ghost a metaphor for guilt, a way to enforce ancestor veneration? Or was it genuinely believed that a spirit—
You duck under a low archway, brushing past a frayed length of linen fluttering like a forgotten curtain. The air here thickens, cooler, but laced with something metallic, like a memory of dried blood or ancient sweat. You're not in a storeroom now, not exactly. You're in the priest's archive, a place most common Babylonians never entered. Even the rats tread lightly here. At the center of this cramped, clay-walled chamber sits a stone table, scored and gouged with centuries of inscriptions. Around you, rows of shelves sag under the weight of hundreds of cuneiform goblets, each one a whisper from the past. Recipes, rituals, curses, blessings, shopping lists, love letters. But tonight, you're only interested in one kind of tablet, the kind that tells a spirit where to go. See, the Babylonians weren't just obsessed with ghosts, they were bureaucrats about it. Every haunting, every unexplained spoilage, every night terror got logged, analyzed, and, if you were lucky, ritually resolved. They had an entire genre of texts called the Maklu series, which basically translates to burning. These weren't cozy bedtime stories. They were manual-level instructions for dealing with spirits who'd overstayed their welcome. And here's the wild part. These tablets included legal-style language, almost like ghost eviction notices. They'd start with phrases like, "to the spirit who clings unjustly," and end with a litany of punishments. You'd swear half of them sound like what a Babylonian landlord might shout through a wall. "You have no claim, you have no kin here, depart or be scattered." Mainstream historians agree that these weren't just symbolic, they were performative magic. You didn't just read the tablet, you recited it, burned it, buried it, sometimes even dissolved it in beer and poured it onto a grave. Why beer? Fringe theory time. Some believe beer symbolized life, and by pouring it on a cursed object, you overwhelmed the death energy. Or maybe, as some scholars half joke, it just made the whole experience more tolerable. One especially grim example from the Nineveh tablets details how a spirit tied to the bones of a goat needed to be summoned, bound, and released using a series of invocations involving moonlight, salt, and, bizarrely, shoes. Yes, shoes. The instructions call for stamping your foot while declaring the spirit banished, like scolding a ghosty toddler. Historians still argue whether these tablets were written by temple priests exclusively, or if wealthy citizens had ghost resolution kits they could keep at home. Imagine flipping open your spiritual first aid kit. One incantation scroll, a pinch of sulfur, and a palm-sized tablet reading, "Do not return." You run your hand along one of the shelves. A stack of tablets crumbles slightly at your touch, revealing a neat bundle of waxed string used to tie purification charms. One charm dangles from a peg nearby, a bronze crescent with a tiny face etched into it, eyes wide, mouth open, as if forever shouting. This wasn't decorative, it was directional. It told bad spirits where to not go. You. Among the tablets, you spot a title roughly translating to Instruction for Redirecting the Hungry Dead. There it is, that one phrase that sums up half the Babylonian fear profile. Because if there was one ghost they dreaded more than the angry one, it was the hungry one. The kind that wandered into storerooms not out of spite, but need. These spirits were believed to be victims of neglect, the unburied, the unprayed for, the unfed. And the fix? A banquet. Seriously. Babylonians believed that staging a symbolic meal, bread, dates, beer, maybe some onions if you were feeling fancy, could satisfy the spirit and send it away content. Picture a picnic, but everyone's invited, except the living. And don't think you could skimp. There are records of people getting haunted again because the offerings were too small. A thin man gave thin bread, one tablet scolds. Translation, you're cheap and now your attic is cursed. One of the more obscure tablets in the archive includes what scholars call the looping chant, a series of 9 lines chanted in a cycle until the spirit responded. There's no instruction on how to know it's worked, which has led to speculation. Did the air get colder? Did a shadow flicker? Or did you just chant until your voice gave out and hope the ghost took the hint? Here's a fringe but fantastic theory. Some believe that the entire purpose of these texts wasn't to resolve hauntings, but to train the spirit to act differently, like spiritual behavior modification. Instead of kicking the ghost out, you just got it to behave politely. Storage ghosts could be useful after all. Some traditions.
You step carefully over a threshold worn smooth by centuries of barefoot priests, merchants, and maybe the occasional panicked neighbor hauling out cursed lentils. The room beyond feels oddly warm, like the bricks themselves remember fire. Here, the shadows aren't quite so still. You pass a cracked lamp in the corner, its wick long gone, but its bowl still blackened with soot. Someone lit this once, not for light, but for something else. You've entered the sacred zone of ritual purification, and tonight you're getting the full dusty backstage pass. When a Babylonian storeroom started to feel off, bad smells, weird dreams, sudden mold, or just a general vibe like something was watching you, it wasn't time to call the landlord, it was time for a cleansing. And not the quick sage smudging one incantation fits all kind. Babylonian purification rituals were elaborate, a full production. Incense, chants, burnt offerings, sometimes even animal sacrifice. Though if that makes you squeamish, good news, they usually saved that part for the truly haunted spots or temples that needed a deep spiritual scrub. The goal, not just to drive out spirits, but to restore cosmic balance. Because in their worldview, hauntings weren't just personal, they were universal. Your funky-smelling storage jar, it could be disrupting the harmony between gods, humans, and the underworld. Bit dramatic, but hey, they took their grain seriously. Let's start with the fire part. Lamps weren't just for seeing, they were for banishing. Light was divine. Fire, especially controlled flame, was sacred. When you lit a flame in a dark room, it wasn't about illumination. It was about forcing spirits into visibility, or, in some cases, into retreat. Like flicking on the hallway light when you're convinced your coat rack is a burglar. Except here, the burglar's invisible and possibly ancient. Most purification ceremonies began with fumigation, burning specific woods and herbs, like juniper or tamarisk, believed to drive out spiritual contamination. You'd fill the room with smoke while chanting, not gently wafting like you're seasoning soup. We're talking eye-watering, nose-clogging, should-have-worn goggles levels of smoke. Apparently, ghosts hate bad ventilation. Mainstream historians have translated dozens of these purification chants. One of the most famous opens with, "O spirit who flits like the wind, be gone with the flame." Pretty poetic, also very effective when whispered while dramatically throwing powder into a fire. You're encouraged to try it next time your rice shelf gives you the creeps. But the smoke wasn't the only element at play. Water had its turn too. Blessed water, collected at dawn from flowing sources, was sprinkled around the room using a broom-like bundle of reeds. You'd trace the corners, the shelves, the storage jars. It wasn't just about cleaning, it was about binding, locking the spirit out, or in. Depends on how cooperative your spirit was feeling that day. Here's your quirky fringe theory. Some researchers believe the Babylonians thought that certain objects absorbed evil, literally sucked it in like a sponge. That meant storerooms could become haunted not because a spirit wandered in, but because a jar, a broom, even a rope had marinated in bad vibes for too long. One clay tablet even lists evil cloth as a possible culprit. Evil cloth? You'll never look at your dish towel the same again. Rituals had to be done in the right sequence. One misstep, lighting the lamp before reciting the protective verse, sprinkling water counterclockwise instead of clockwise, and boom, the spirit wasn't banished. It was annoyed. Congratulations, your storeroom is now extra haunted. So who performed these rituals? Not just anyone. You couldn't just DIY your exorcism with a scroll and some rosemary. You needed an ashipu, a ritual healer, a spiritual technician of sorts. The ashipu would show up in dramatic robes, probably with great fringe, chant in Sumerian or Akkadian, and perform the purification with total authority. If spirits were unruly teenagers, the ashipu was the exhausted parent who knew exactly where the punishment broom was kept. Historians still argue whether these priests were exclusively temple-based or if they made house calls like supernatural plumbers. There's evidence for both. One letter from a merchant in Sipar complains that his ashipu showed up 3 days late and didn't bring enough incense. A haunting and a bad Yelp review. You pause near a ledge where blackened coals sit in a little pile. You wander out from the shadows of broken jars into a brighter space where the sun might have once reached the floor. Here, your feet brush over scattered fragments of pottery, crumbled remnants of what once stored precious oils, grains, and who knows what else. This was the physical heart of the Babylonian storeroom, the tangible place where human care and neglect left marks beyond words and spirits. Let's get something straight. These storerooms weren't just cluttered corners, they were lifelines. Your family's survival hinged on what was kept safe here. Grains, dried fish, preserved fruits, all of it meant the difference between feast and famine, prosperity and despair. So when a spirit got restless in a storeroom, it wasn't just spooky folklore, it was economic crisis personified. Babylonians didn't separate the spiritual from the practical. If a sack of barley spoiled unexpectedly, the cause wasn't simply mold or humidity. Nope, somewhere deeper, beyond the shelf and jar, lay a spiritual imbalance. That weird smell? A warning sign. Rats? More than rodents, they were spirit messengers, an omen of disruption. If you ignored those signs, your granary might go empty next season, literally. Historians still argue whether this connection between spirits and spoilage was pragmatic superstition or proto-science. Some suggest Babylonians observed patterns, grain that spoiled when rituals were skipped, and so spiritual explanations filled gaps in their early understanding. Others think it was a cultural lens shaping how problems were framed. Now, here's your fringe detail. There's evidence that Babylonians created special jars for spirit containment. These vessels weren't for food at all. They were tiny, sealed, and inscribed with protective curses meant to trap malicious spirits. Imagine a ghost jar, like a magical Tupperware designed to lock in bad vibes. Sometimes these jars were buried under floors or hidden in walls, a silent spiritual quarantine. One of the most fascinating discoveries was a jar containing ashes, hair, and tiny inscribed tablets, the remains of a ritual aimed at imprisoning a particularly troublesome spirit, blamed for repeated grain spoilage. The label, roughly translated, read, "For the one who steals the harvest." That's right. Ancient spirit accusations had scapegoats, and jars served as spiritual prisons. You almost chuckle picturing this, a babbling priest chanting over a little jar while the homeowner watches nervously. Don't let it out, it's got commitment issues. But it's not all doom and gloom. Sometimes spirits in storerooms were thought to be guardians rather than pests. Certain tablets mention household protective ghosts, or lamassu, winged creatures with a human head, lion's body, and eagle's wings, that could inhabit a storeroom and keep theft and spoilage at bay. Those spirits demanded offerings and respect, but in return, they kept your goods safe. It's like having a very demanding, invisible security system. The duality of spirits, both helpful and harmful, reflects a key Babylonian worldview. The universe was a complex, intertwined system of forces where balance mattered. Your job as a householder was to maintain that balance with rituals, offerings, and respect. You run your fingers over the rough edge of a potsherd, feeling a quiet connection across millennia. It makes you think. How many modern pests and food spoilage problems do we blame on faulty wiring or faulty refrigerators? Maybe in their time, Babylonians were onto something with their spiritual storage solutions. And maybe, just maybe, we've all got a little spirit whispering in our pantry, reminding us to respect what sustains us.
You step into a narrower hallway lined with stacked clay jars, their surfaces mottled with age and mineral stains. The air here carries a faint whisper, as if the room itself is reluctant to let go of its secrets. You're beginning to see how storerooms functioned as liminal spaces, not quite alive, not quite dead, where the ordinary and the supernatural rubbed shoulders in uneasy truce. Babylonians believed that these spaces were especially vulnerable to spiritual intrusion because they held the physical traces of life's essentials, food, drink, wealth, and therefore attracted attention from both benevolent and malevolent forces. It's as if the very things that sustained you in life also tethered you to the spirit world after death. You might be surprised to learn that some Babylonians practiced what scholars now call spirit recycling. When a storeroom became too haunted or cluttered with spiritual tension, priests sometimes conducted elaborate purification rites that involved transferring spirits from one vessel or room to another, hoping to ease their unrest. It was a spiritual form of spring cleaning, if you will. One fascinating fact is that these rituals could include the symbolic feeding of spirits, offering food and drink in miniature ceramic dishes carefully placed in corners or niches. These offerings weren't just random acts of kindness, they were diplomatic gestures meant to convince spirits to settle down and stop causing trouble. Historians still argue how widespread this practice was. Was it a specialized priestly duty or something common among households desperate for peace? The evidence is tantalizingly fragmentary, leaving much to the imagination. In the quirkiest fringe finds, archaeologists uncovered tiny ceramic ghost boats buried beneath storerooms. Some speculate these were vessels meant to ferry troublesome spirits safely out of the household, an ancient Airbnb for restless souls. Whether fact or fancy, the idea sparks a smile. You can't help but wonder how many of these little boats sailed unseen on the currents of Babylonian belief, carrying spirits to wherever they hoped the afterlife might be less crowded. As you lean against a cool stone wall, the silence presses in, and you think about the Babylonian sense of order, the cosmic balance, and how storerooms were microcosms of that vast universe. Mess up the order here, and the whole house might topple, spiritually speaking. You imagine the ritual specialist sweeping through with incense and prayers, restoring calm, as the jars sit in patient rows, silent witnesses to centuries of human hope, fear, and care. These storerooms were more than dusty corners. They were sacred spaces where the living negotiated with the dead, where memory was kept alive not just in words, but in every grain and jar. And that, you realize, might be why the Babylonians were so meticulous with their storage rituals, because the past, quite literally, was stored right there beside the bread and oil. You move deeper into the labyrinthine storerooms, where the air is heavy with the scent of aged clay, dried herbs, and a faint trace of something burnt, reminders of countless rituals performed here over centuries. You sense that these rooms were never just about storage or superstition. They were a battleground for competing beliefs about life, death, and the invisible world. The Babylonians were pioneers in creating detailed instructions for managing these encounters. But what about the stories people told each other in whispers and shadows? Oral traditions, passed down alongside official texts, filled in the emotional gaps left by dry tablets and ritual codes. One such story tells of a farmer who, after a series of misfortunes, consulted a temple priest. The priest advised him to place a spirit marker in his storeroom, a carved stone figurine meant to appease the restless dead. The farmer complied, but the next morning found the figurine broken and a mysterious footprint smeared in ash. The message was clear: the spirit was still present and not amused. This tale, like many others, reflects a belief in the agency of spirits, not just as passive echoes, but as active participants in daily life. These stories, though not always recorded officially, were vital in shaping how Babylonians lived with their fears. Interestingly, some fringe scholars propose that certain storeroom hauntings might have been linked to mental health experiences. Night terrors, sleep paralysis, and hallucinations could have been interpreted as spirit visitations, creating a rich but complex tapestry of belief and experience. Though modern minds separate these phenomena, to a Babylonian they were woven into the same spiritual fabric. Historians still argue whether the distinction between actual hauntings and metaphorical storytelling was clear-cut or blurred in everyday Babylonian culture. Were some hauntings purely symbolic warnings, or did people genuinely believe in spirits' physical presence? In any case, these stories served a purpose. They were cautionary tales urging respect for ancestors, proper ritual observance, and community cohesion. A storeroom ghost wasn't just a nuisance, it was a messenger carrying the weight of collective memory and cultural norms. As you walk past a weathered wooden beam inscribed with faint cuneiform marks, you feel the pulse of these ancient narratives resonating through time. They remind you that behind every haunted storeroom lay not only fear, but also hope, that harmony could be restored if humans listened carefully enough. You pause to imagine the voices around a Babylonian hearth, sharing these tales softly as the fire flickers. The past speaks not just through stone tablets, but through the breath of stories, comforting and warning in equal measure. And in that shared space between fact and myth, the spirit world feels surprisingly close, like a familiar presence waiting patiently for you to remember.
You step back into the cool dusk of the storeroom's outer chambers, where the shadows stretch long and the air feels thick with forgotten stories. By now, you're beginning to realize that the Babylonian storeroom wasn't just a place to stash goods. It was a crossroads where the living and the dead negotiated, a threshold bristling with tension and, surprisingly, humor. It turns out, these ancient folks weren't just terrified of spirits, they also had a cheeky sense of humor about them. Some of the tablets you've glimpsed reveal incantations with playful, almost sarcastic language aimed at ghosts. One curse reads something like, "You, who eat my onions and steal my sleep, go wander the marshes and sleep with the frogs." You almost picture a priest with a smirk, half bored, half annoyed, issuing this spiritual eviction notice. Mainstream historians agree that humor played a subtle but important role in ritual. By mocking the spirits, the living could assert power, reminding restless entities that they were firmly in charge. It was psychological warfare wrapped in poetry. Then there's the surprisingly bureaucratic side to it. The Babylonians documented spirit complaints as meticulously as they did trade disputes. There are tablets listing grievances from haunted storerooms. Jars mysteriously emptied, breads vanished, or livestock spooked at midnight. Sometimes the blame got laid on very specific spirits, with names, family relations, and even assigned punishments. You could say the Babylonians invented the first spiritual HR department. One particularly curious tablet details a case where a ghost supposedly filed a complaint against a household for insufficient offerings. It's written in a legalistic tone, complete with dates and witnesses, as if the spirit had taken its case to a celestial court. Historians still debate whether this was literal or allegorical, but the idea that spirits had bureaucratic recourse is both hilarious and oddly reassuring. The quirkiest fringe theory is that some of these stories might have inspired early comedy sketches performed during festivals, ghost tales exaggerated for laughs. Perhaps the audience enjoyed a break from more solemn rituals by imagining annoyed spirits behaving like disgruntled tenants. In one example, a ritual text instructs priests to speak to the ghost as if negotiating rent. "You may stay one night, but no longer." This kind of humor softened the fear, turning a terrifying experience into something manageable. You imagine the communal storytelling that must have occurred around these haunted storerooms. Old folks sharing ghostly anecdotes with a wink, children daring each other to peek inside the scary jars, and priests keeping the peace with a blend of magic and wit. But make no mistake, beneath the jokes lay real anxiety. A storeroom spirit's displeasure could mean ruin, social shame, or worse. The Babylonians lived in a world where the line between the mundane and the supernatural blurred daily. You take a breath and smile softly. Even thousands of years ago, humans found ways to laugh in the face of fear, and maybe that's the oldest trick in the book. The storeroom's dim light flickers as you trace the outlines of old doorways and niches carved into thick mud brick walls. These were not merely architectural features, but spiritual thresholds, designed to channel or block unseen forces. The Babylonians believed that spirits didn't just wander aimlessly. They moved through specific points, like doorways or cracks, and storerooms were prime portals. You might think of these thresholds as the ancient equivalent of keep out signs or security cameras. They marked the boundary between human order and spiritual chaos. That's why many storerooms featured intricate boundary markers, carvings, inscriptions, or even tiny statues to guard these liminal zones. One mainstream fact is that some doors or walls had apotropaic inscriptions, words or spells meant to turn away evil. They weren't just decorative, they were active defenses, a blend of art and magic. Often, these inscriptions warned wandering spirits that entry was forbidden unless they came with proper permission or offerings. The fringe detail is even more colorful. Some inscriptions included humorous curses. Instead of just "go away," they threaten spirits with everything from an itchy rash to a lifetime of bad breath if they overstayed their welcome. You can't help but picture a ghost grimacing, clutching its spectral nose. Historians still debate whether these funny curses were practical protective measures or simply a way to inject levity into otherwise grim rituals. But they reveal a fascinating human touch, the desire to control fear with laughter. Babylonian architecture reflected this spiritual vigilance too. Storerooms sometimes had double doors or small shuttered windows, not for light or air, but to control spirit access. Narrow, winding entrances acted like spiritual airlocks, forcing any ghostly visitor to pass through carefully guarded checkpoints. You realize that the very design of these rooms echoed Babylonian cosmology. The universe was layered, compartmentalized, and full of guarded gates. If the cosmos had a blueprint, storerooms followed a similar pattern. As you explore further, you find a tiny clay tablet wedged in a crack. It's an inventory list, but at the bottom, scribbled hastily, is a note. "Remember the storeroom ghosts. Feed well or face their wrath." You chuckle softly. Even after thousands of years, the message is clear. Respect your ghosts or deal with the consequences. You pause to imagine the daily life in a Babylonian home. Every meal prepared with a nod to unseen watchers. Every jar lid sealed with a prayer. These invisible custodians were as much a part of domestic routine as cooking or cleaning. This blend of architecture, ritual, and humor shaped a complex relationship with the past and the spirit world. It was not fear alone that defined this interaction, but respect and a dash of wit. You leave the storeroom corridor feeling a bit lighter, as if you've made friends with these ancient spirits, who were never truly malevolent, just misunderstood guardians of an old, fragile order. You step back into the warm glow of the main storeroom, where jars and baskets nestle close together like old friends sharing secrets. Here, amid the familiar scent of barley and frankincense, you begin to grasp the profound social role these storerooms played, not just as practical spaces, but as cultural hubs linking family, community, and the divine. In Babylonian society, storerooms were symbols of prosperity and stability. A well-stocked storeroom broadcasted a family's status and ability to withstand hard times. But beyond that, it was a sacred trust. People believed that spirits monitored the care given to these resources, rewarding diligence with protection or punishing neglect with misfortune. One mainstream fact is that storerooms were often the center of ritual activities, especially during harvest festivals. Offerings were made here to ensure ongoing fertility of crops and the goodwill of household spirits. The storeroom was not just a warehouse, but a living space of spiritual economy. The fringe curiosity is that some Babylonians believed storerooms had personality traits. Some were moody, prone to attracting restless spirits, while others were peaceful and protective. There were rituals aimed specifically at calming a temperamental storeroom spirit, almost like soothing a cranky toddler. Historians still argue whether these traits were metaphors for the storeroom's physical state, dampness, pests, or disorganization, or genuine spiritual conditions affecting the household's fate. Socially, the storeroom linked the domestic with the cosmic. It was a physical repository of wealth, yes, but also a symbolic anchor holding family history, memory, and future hopes. Ancestor spirits were thought to linger here, silently judging how well their descendants honored the family legacy. In fact, some tomb inscriptions mention storerooms as part of the house of the living, where the deceased spirit could return and find comfort. Storerooms were, in a way, bridges between worlds, where past and present converged in quiet continuity. You imagine a Babylonian family gathering around the storeroom entrance, offering prayers or songs during harvest season, aware of the invisible eyes watching over their fate. This ritual intimacy strengthened bonds not only between humans and spirits, but within communities. As you take a final glance at the storeroom shadows, you realize how deeply intertwined daily life and spirituality were for the Babylonians. Their storerooms were more than dusty relics. They were living heartbeats of ancient belief, resilience, and hope. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson you can carry forward, that even the most mundane spaces can hold stories far richer than they first appear. You linger now in the fading light, surrounded by the quiet murmur of history etched into every jar and stone. The storeroom, once a mere backdrop to daily life, has unfolded into a vibrant stage where ancient Babylonians played out their hopes, fears, and dreams, negotiating with spirits who were never far from their thoughts. The last piece of this puzzle lies in how these beliefs influenced Babylonian law and order. Storerooms were sometimes the sites of disputes over stolen goods, spoiled provisions, or broken agreements, and spirits were called upon to witness and enforce these social contracts. This gave the storeroom a role not just in household management, but in the community's moral framework. A fascinating fact is that some legal texts include curses invoking storeroom spirits to punish thieves or oathbreakers. The threat of spiritual retribution was a powerful deterrent, blending law with supernatural enforcement in a way modern systems rarely attempt. On the fringe side, there's speculation that some storeroom spirits evolved into early forms of guardian deities, embodied protectors that transcended their ghostly origins. These figures sometimes merged with city gods, blurring the lines between personal and civic protection. Historians still debate how this transformation took place and whether it was a conscious evolution or a gradual merging of myths and practices over centuries. As you reflect on these stories, you realize that the Babylonians' intimate relationship with their storerooms offers a timeless insight, that human survival is as much about managing the unseen, our fears, beliefs, and memories, as it is about the visible world. You picture yourself closing the storeroom door one last time, the faint echo of a chant lingering in the air, a whispered promise that the spirits, like the past, never truly leave us. And as you step back into the quiet night, you carry with you the gentle reminder that in every corner of the ancient world, and perhaps in your own home, there's a space where the sacred and the ordinary meet. Wind down. Now, as you settle deeper into your pillow, feel the soft hum of history wrap around you like a familiar blanket. The voices of the past, with their dusty jars and whispered prayers, grow quieter, fading gently into the calm night. You've traveled through storerooms where spirits wandered, where laughter mixed with fear, where life's essentials were guarded by unseen hands. There's a quiet comfort in knowing that these ancient souls, with their rituals and stories, were much like us, seeking peace, order, and connection in a vast, unpredictable world. Let that thought settle softly, easing your mind and smoothing the edges of the day. Allow the rhythm of forgotten prayers and gentle footsteps to lull you toward rest. The spirits have returned to their jars. The storerooms stand silent and watchful. And now, so can you. Sleep well, and let your dreams carry you through the quiet corridors of time.